Good evening. Yeah, my name is Neil McReynolds, member of the Environment Committee, which is a sponsor for this evening's event. We'll be focusing on energy. In this region, we have a good supply of electrical energy at a very cheap price for many, many decades. But the power picture is changing. And here in the Northwest, it's going to be quite a change for those of us who've had the pleasure over the years of plentiful energy. So the question then is, are these electrical shortages or double-digit increases, are they part of our future? Well, these are the kind of questions that are being asked these days and people are wondering about. So to give us an idea of what to expect, we invited our speaker this evening, who's had a very knowledgeable person in the Pacific Northwest when it comes to energy. He's been held major leadership roles here in this region in the electrical energy area. And for the past 25 years has been providing strategic advice to utilities, wind and renewable generators, and other organizations in the rapidly changing electricity environment. Our speaker is Randy Hardy, who has served as CEO of Seattle City Light, and that was in the 1980s, and CEO of Bonneville Power Administration in the 1990s. Now, we're familiar with Seattle City Light. That's our utility. But what about BPA? Well, BPA is a $2.4 billion public corporation which supplies 40% of all electricity and about 75% of the high voltage transmission here in the Pacific Northwest, as well as distributing hydropower from 31 federal dams. It's a big job. Randy's held two significant national roles in addition to the job at Seattle City Light and BPA. He's been president of the American Public Power Association and board chair of the Electric Power Research Institute. That's the industry's R&D arm. Earlier this month, a new question has been raised in the state about our energy future, with the state being faced with energy shortages because of the impact of large new data centers being built in central Washington that require enormous amounts of electricity. The Seattle Times did a major story on this issue this past week, and we went to Randy for his comments. So Randy's response was, well, you've got a dilemma, how you're going to meet these additional load from data centers, or frankly, with any resources. With that as the region's big new challenge, it gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce Randy Hardy. Randy?
There we go. Okay. Thank you, Neil, for that gracious introduction. Whoop. Okay. Well, Neil kind of filled you into my background. To give you a full perspective, I'm a Naval Academy graduate. I'm a Naval Academy graduate. I spent 10 years of active duty from 1966 to 76 on destroyers, mostly in the Gulf of Tonkin, and then got married, and we decided that a continuation in the Navy wasn't the greatest thing. So I was fortunate to be able to start a second career in the electric utility business, and we moved out here about the same time. And like Neil said, I've run Seattle City Light and the Bonneville Power Administration, as well as holding a number of other jobs. I thought today I would talk first about the transition that this region is trying to make from fossil fuel energy to predominantly renewable energy, wind and solar and storage, and some of the challenges associated with that. I'm a believer in climate change, and I'm in favor of making that transition, but to be blunt about it, we're not going about it in the best way possible, and I'll go through that with you. Also, at the end of my prepared remarks, I'll spend about 5 minutes talking about the recent Trump administration staff reductions in Bonneville, and stupidity is a mild term to describe them, but I'll go through them in a way that describes what the impacts are and how, if the president were a little more knowledgeable about this, he could have done the same thing with minimal adverse impacts. So, to start out on the renewables kind of transition that the region is trying to make. Both Oregon and Washington have state laws passed in 2019 in Washington and 2021 in Oregon, that mandate that all the region's utilities achieve 80% clean energy by 2030. The specifics differ a little bit, but that's the basic premise of the legislation, which is a good premise, but a bit overly ambitious. These two, because the publics buy all of their power either from Bonneville or their own hydropower, the publicly owned systems don't have to worry about this. They're already over 90% clean. So that's not an issue, but it is for the investor-owned utilities like Puget Sound Energy and Portland General Electric, who are more predominantly thermal-based utilities, i.e. coal and natural gas-fired combustion turbines. So that's a significant challenge. The 2030 date in particular is a challenge because you have to do this all in 5 years. And the problem here is that all the wind and solar are on the east side of the Cascades. And all the loads are in Portland and Seattle. And the transmission lines from the east side to the west side of the Cascades are all fully loaded. So a big challenge. And it takes you 10 to 15 years to build a new transmission line and site it. And, that's the nature of the challenge. The 2030 date is completely out of sync with the reality of building the transmission lines you need to build or upgrade to get to 80% clean energy by 2030. Now, there are ways to deal with that, and I'm here to tell you it can be done, not by 2030, more by 2035 or so, but it can be done, and Bonneville in particular has identified basically $5 billion of transmission, primarily upgrades, that will get it done, but again, more in the 2033 to 35 time frame than by 2030, and that's the challenge that we face. Most of the Bonneville lines that are going to be built, and a couple by Portland General Electric, are not new lines. They're upgrades of lines from 230 kilovolts to 500 kilovolts. 500 kV is the standard high voltage transmission voltage for the Northwest. It's the highest voltage that we use. But you can upgrade a number of the 230 lines, and that doubles the amount of energy that you can deliver from east to west. And that's the kind of the cornerstone of the strategy. You have other devices like reconductoring existing lines or putting in devices called series capacitors that reroute the power to lesser used paths and whatnot. But rather than get into all the technical details, you've got a variety of methods that can make this transition happen or enable it to happen, but they take time. And the legislature passed these laws, like I say, back in 2019 and 2021, and then 80% sounds good, so we'll pass it. And another motivation, frankly, for the legislature was California had established a 60%, clean energy goal by 2030. So the legislature said, well, we can beat California. Typical legislative reasoning and grossly inaccurate. But in fairness, they didn't know about the transmission realities. Well, we're now dealing with those in the 10 to 15 years to build new transmission, and even to upgrade existing transmission, you're talking about 5 to 8 years, where you're using the same right-of-way and whatnot. So achievable, yes. Get to 80%, yes. By 2030, no. 2035, probably. So that's kind of where we are in this renewable transition. Now, there are costs to doing that, which I'll get to in a moment, which are considerable, like $6-7 billion. $5 billion from Bonneville, and another probably $2 to $3 billion for the Portland General and Puget. The second element of the cost equation is the actual cost of acquiring new renewable resources. So what you're going to have to do if you're Portland General Electric or Puget is right now you're about 50% clean, mainly because of your hydropower and the contracts that both Puget and PGE have with the Mid-Columbia PUDs, Priest Rapids, Wanapum, Rocky Reach, Rock Island dams, and wells for Douglas. So you're about 50% clean, and they've acquired some wind projects, principally in Montana, which has the best wind in the region. And they phased out their are phasing out their transmission from Colstrip, the coal plant in eastern Montana, all the way to their service territories. And as they phase that out, they'll substitute projects, wind projects from eastern Montana that can plug into that same transmission line, and you're just repurposing existing transmission to wheel wind energy instead of Colstrip coal energy. So they're busy doing that, which gets them, has already gotten them to about, along with their existing hydro, to about 50% clean. But they got another 30% to go. Here comes the challenge. They've got to fill that 30%. There's no more hydro left to go around, and there's no more nuclear, which is free, which is emissions free. So you got to rely on wind and solar, and to some extent storage. The problem there is that wind and solar. Now you can build a solar plant in Central Oregon, which is probably about the best place to build solar, for $55 a megawatt hour. Now, don't worry about the precise. These are relative figures I'm going to give you. So you can build a solar plant for a bus bar, meaning right at the generator cost of about $55 a megawatt hour. But that's not the electricity that needs to get delivered to the residential consumer in Portland or in Seattle. To that, you have to add balancing, load following, transmission costs, which are double or triple what a fossil fuel plant is, because you're only using the transmission is take or pay, and you're only using transmission a third or a half of the time. And then finally, you have to go out and purchase additional generation for when the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine. Okay? That adds $25 to $30 a megawatt hour to the $55 cost. Okay? So you're talking about an $80 resource, not a $55 one, which is what you read in the newspapers all the time, for the actual delivered cost to you as the consumer from a renewable project. Existing fossil fuel plants that you're phasing out are probably average about $40. So you're going to trade, probably 3,000 or 4,000 megawatts of current $40 energy for the same amount or even a greater amount of renewable energy that costs you $80. That's going to increase your utility rates. Puget has just announced, and the WUTC has just approved an 18% retail rate increase. That's the first of several, all of them probably double digits, that you're going to see between now and 2030. Seattle City Light, you're lucky, because Seattle City Light is already 95% clean. But they're worried about electrification and other kinds of low growth trends, so they're going to have to acquire some additional renewables, but not nearly as much. So that's the situation you're in, where you're going from 50 to 80, but you're substituting much more expensive resources, even though they're clean, for less expensive resources. So it puts you in the position of trading off, of getting to a clean energy goal, which is desirable from a public policy standpoint, but having to pay for it in terms of significantly higher retail electricity rates. I've been there, okay? When you build a hydro plant, and I had to build a couple of these when I was at Seattle, maybe you'll appreciate Jerry Garman's Lucky Peak project in particular, where you had to make the same argument. Well, we're incurring short-term costs for long-term benefits because hydro plants last 50 or 60 years. That is a really difficult argument to convince ratepayers that it's rational. But that's the argument that we've got with substituting that amount of renewables. You're incurring short-term costs for benefits that are worldwide benefits that you're going to achieve, but for your grandchildren, or your children, or maybe your grandchildren. That is not an easy argument to make for the people who have to pay the bills. So that's the kind of renewable situation that we're in. A complication to that is that the Northwest, like a number of other regions of the country, has been besieged by data centers. These new, industrial processing of data to promote artificial intelligence, or to give the region in the United States the capability to engage and maximize the benefit of artificial intelligence. But they are tremendously energy intensive. You've got 3,000 megawatts worth of them in Hillsboro alone in Oregon. And then you've got everybody, all the rest of them are on the east side. You've got one of them's a client of mine. It's got a gigawatt, 1,000 megawatt data center to be built in Goldendale in Klickitat County. Small little town, but great tax benefits and others for the community. But how are we going to fuel those? Neil alluded to this in his opening remarks, and the answer is we don't know. Probably a combination of renewables and fossil fuel. So most of the data centers that have been built so far in the Northwest have been in Umatilla County, Hermiston, Oregon, for a variety of specialized reasons. And what they do is they buy renewables when they can, but when they can't, like at nighttime when the sun doesn't shine, they purchase fossil fuel energy from the Mid-Columbia Trading Hub. Or they have their own diesel backups. Now, they don't tend to run the diesels very much, but they do purchase purchase from Mid-Sea. That's a combination of mostly fossil fuels, but also some excess wind and hydro. So, but you need to build much more of that. I can identify sites right now, 8 to 10 gigawatts worth of data centers around the Northwest that are actively spending money and seeking to get stood up. And the only thing that's standing in their way is you can't build the transmission yet, for the very reasons I cited before, to get from point A to point B. And the transmission queue that Bonneville has, it has about 90 gigawatts in the queue, is 5 or 6 years long. And the staffing cuts that Trump has just imposed will lengthen that by another year or two. So you have to stay in the queue and spend a bunch of money, several $1 million to interconnect to the grid, and it's going to take you 5 to 7 to 8 years to do that. That's a tough proposition. So we'll have to see how that all shakes out if the data centers have to wait that long before they can get the transmission to actually get the power, whether it's renewable or fossil fueled, to meet that increase in load. So how does this shake out? Puget actually doesn't have as many severe transmission requirements as Portland General Electric. They might just be able to get to 80% in 2030. I don't think so, but it's possible. The good news is Bonneville has identified, with its $5 billion of transmission build-outs, a set of actions that will enable both Puget and PGE to get to their 80% clean energy goals, not by 2030, but more like 2035. So that's the good news. The bad news is that everybody's going to have a rate increase because of it, and not just a small one, big ones, particularly Puget Power customers and PGE customers. Like I said, Seattle City Light will have some, but much more modest. And you're looking at double-digit rate increases for probably every year for most of the 5 years between now and 2030. That's just the reality, because the utilities have to acquire this so fast, given the 2030 deadline, that there are a lot of extra purchase power expenses and all kinds of other things. And just to get from their present 50% to their 80% clean energy goal. So it is axiomatic that when you have those kinds of retail rate increases, there will be a political reaction. I guarantee you. And the only question is, how strong will it be and what will the results be? I lived through the so-called irate ratepayer rebellion of public utilities in the early 80s when the Whoops plants collapsed. And it was not a pleasant experience. But we made it through, and the bondholders were the ones, Whoops bondholders were the ones who got stiffed and eventually recovered 30 cents on the dollar for what they invested. Here, I think this isn't a bondholder issue like it was with the publicly owned utilities and Whoops. This is a straight ratepayer issue. And what you will see is a lot of pressure on the utilities commissions to not pass through these costs, but it's mandated by state law. So what do? You either abandon the goals, or you try to figure out some mitigation actions. My recommendation has been, and I've told the UTC commissioners this, extend your 2030 deadline to 2035. That gives you 5 more years to spread the costs over, and it's much more in line with what the realities of transmission construction are to even get these things interconnected. Won't eliminate the rate increases, but it will give you a more gradual path to get there and eliminate some of the costs that, because of the accelerated time frame, you have to incur. So that's kind of my synopsis of what to look for in the next 5 years. Let me stop there with that part of the speech and now talk about what's happened in the last week with the Trump administration. So, true to form, the Trump administration on Wednesday announced, on Wednesday there was a court decision that had originally held up the early out program that Trump had applied or was intending, or had been offered to all federal employees. That is, you agree to retire by, I think it was February 6th was the original date, and you'll get paid through September 30th, the end of the federal fiscal year. And that'll reduce your costs. The irony of this, and a bunch of people took this when the court lifted its temporary injunction against this, and then that was followed. That happened Wednesday afternoon. That was followed on Thursday by Trump firing all probationary employees of every federal agency, without regard to anything else. Probationary employees are employees in the first year of their civil service commitment, where the theory is you can be fired because you don't have the civil service protections of normal federal employees in that first year, and you're evaluated, and if you're not doing well enough, then you are let go. But as is the case with most of the employees, you're doing fine, and you automatically then at the end of the 1-year period become a regular federal employee. Well, Trump fired everybody. Including the Bonneville, the 400 employees at Bonneville. So 230 took the early retirement, 400 were fired. This is out of a 3,100 person workforce, okay? The supreme irony of this is Bonneville is financed by you. It's financed by electricity rates that you pay to your utility for every single penny of their expenses. There is not one dime that the federal taxpayer saves by these massive cuts. But, is Trump aware of that? No, he and Musk are completely ignorant, and frankly, they don't care. So you get a top-down, cram-down kind of approach here that is tremendously dysfunctional and poses really serious reliability risks. So let me describe some of those. A number of the early retirements occurred in the power dispatching unit in Bonneville. This is the unit that monitors and keeps the grid operating every 4 seconds, round the clock, 365 days a year. Several of those employees opted for early retirement. Those are employees that are not easily replaced. They typically require 20 or 25 years of experience, and they're the most knowledgeable people in the utility. So, you fired you had a bunch of those that have taken early retirement, along with a bunch of your line workers who are probably second, not for power outages, but for restoring the power once it gets out. I'll give you one example. An entire line crew in Kalispell, Montana, retired. Okay, they're gone. If the lines go down, there's nobody to fix them. And you got to have instead of 2 hours for the Kalispell Bonneville crew to come out and restore power and put the lines back up, you got to truck over a crew from Spokane. So instead of 2 hours, it's 2 days that you got to suffer without power. So that's just an example. And from the power dispatchers and schedulers and others taking early retirement, again, that increases your risk because you've got less experienced people that you're going to have to put in there that don't have the experience of the others. I don't know how much it does. Typically, Bonneville's, your unplanned outage risk is 1/10%, if that. I don't know whether this will be 1% or 5% or some other number, but it ain't zero. And it puts the very reliability of the system at risk for unplanned outages that are considerable. So that's another kind of risk. Again, another irony of this program, of the early out program portion of the program that the Trump administration imposed. I did this when I was administrator back in 1995. Right after wholesale deregulation of the electricity business in the early 90s, we woke up one day in April of 95 and discovered that our wholesale rate was $28 a megawatt hour, and Enron was offering 5-year contracts to all of our publicly utility and aluminum company customers at $15 to $17 a megawatt hour. And we didn't have take-or-pay contracts. So we went through a massive set of cost-cutting exercises. We capped our fish costs, we terminated the remaining 2 nuclear plants, WIPS plants, and the list goes on. But one of the things we did is I offered, Senator Hatfield, thank goodness, gave us the legislative authorization to do this. I offered a buyout incentive up to $25,000 a person for people to voluntarily leave. I reduced the workforce by 1,000 employees that way. It was all voluntary, okay? It made us money in the long term because of retirement benefits and everything else. But I fenced off critical positions like power dispatchers and line workers were not eligible to take it. So I didn't allow it to be applied to any of the critical reliability provisions, positions in Bonneville. And like I say, we went from 4,000 employees to 3,000. And that's where Bonneville about is today. It has about 3,100 employees. So the irony, again, is the Trump administration could have done this in a reasonable way if it would have consulted the utility. But that's, of course, not how this guy operates. So instead, we have it just crammed down. And now everybody's struggling to, now they've repealed some of it. Instead of firing all 400 probationary employees, now Bonneville's been allowed to retain 300, and we're arguing about the remaining 100, and the hiring freeze went along with this about some relief from the hiring freeze for critical health and safety positions. But it's insane that you even had to go through this, but it's a combination of ignorance and, frankly, lack of caring of what the impacts are. So, the result of this, well, first of all, this is applied because the public conception of a federal employee is a paper pusher that doesn't do anything else. These are operating the transmission grid. These and the Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Reclamation, people that operate Grand Coulee and the rest of the federal dams, these are just as valuable as any private sector employees. But that's not, that distinction between administrative and actual operational capability, where you've got basic health and safety issues at play, was not recognized by the administration. In any case, even with the partial restoration that we've received, Bonneville has lost, by my count, about 420 employees out of its 3,100 person workforce. That's a 14% staff reduction that happened in 2 days. Okay? Imagine with the organizations that you've worked for in your careers, if you imposed a 15% or 14% work reduction in 2 days and then said, okay, go ahead and operate like you used to do. Not very likely, okay? But that's what we've been struggling with. Those kinds of things. And the Vancouver the power dispatchers and others are particularly hard to replace. You know, they're not replaceable in the near term. You can substitute lesser qualified people and you can work more overtime, but the replacements in the long term are difficult enough. In the near term, they're next to impossible. I mean, you'll cover with what you've got, and Bonneville will do that, but your outage risk, your unplanned outage risk, will increase commensurately, and you know, and we'll simply have to wait and see what happens. So that's a you know, brief summary of kind of what's happened with the Trump administration, and some of us are in the middle of this firefight, trying to get sanity restored, if that's possible, with this administration, you know, to allow Bonneville to at least still incur significant staff cuts, even though it makes no financial sense, but still operate and provide you with reliable power 24/7. So let me stop there, and that's the end of my prepared remarks, but I'm happy to answer any questions anybody would have.
Yes, we'll follow the usual procedure here with raise your hand. I'll identify you and we'll take your answers. But so with that, John, you saw your hand up there first. Yeah.
Do you foresee the nuclear power playing any significant role in the Northwest in the out years?
I'm sorry, nuclear, you said?
Nuclear power?
Possibly. You've got a lot of discussion about small nuclear reactors that, you know, that don't have boilers, supposedly are simpler, which have some interesting possibilities because they're, you know, CO2 free. But they're in the R&D stage. This is 5 to 7 years away before these things are going to, we need them now, but we're not going to have them for 5 to 7 years. That's point one. Point two is, having dealt with the whoops issue and terminated 2 whoops plants myself, you know, they're perfectly safe. That I'm not worried about, but they are extremely capital intensive, you know, so they are enormously costly. So my personal guess is, so right now you have fossil fuel plants like I was talking about before that are $40, renewables even with deliver costs that are $80. Nukes are going to, they're right now, they're at $100, but they're going to be $150, $200 a megawatt hour. You know, so they're going to be double or triple what you know, what current rates are, even for renewables, and the public's going to have to, you know, absorb those kinds of costs. That's the problem, John.
We got one here. Neil, over here. We're trying to shade the side.
These data plants, ones I've seen have big flat roofs. Are they, any of them have solar panels? Or are they required to have them? And why don't we not require new construction in the state of Washington to have solar panels?
Well, none of them have solar panels that I'm aware of. They are trying, in fairness, to procure solar energy from regular solar plants in Central Oregon or Central Washington, but that requires transmission. You can put solar on the rooftops if you wanted to. It doesn't help you a whole lot. You need massive fields worth of solar, you know, panels to give you the requisite number of megawatts to service a 1 gigawatt data center. You know, 1,000 megawatt data center like the one that's in Goldendale in Klickitat County. Just isn't enough. By putting the solar panels on the roofs or nearby, you need much more extensive solar panel fields to get the requisite number of megawatts to fuel those data centers. And of course, the sun didn't shine at night, so you got to find your power from somewhere else. Maybe the wind blows, but you know, and you end up going to the mid-sea trading hub, and what you purchase there is probably half or more fossil fuel. And that's just the reality of these things. Until you have long-term storage, right now you have lithium-ion batteries, which are good for 4 hours. You need 8 to 10 to 12 hours of storage so you can make it through a cold winter night with the solar power that you've generated during the day before you can operate on an or renewable. We don't have that now, and we're not likely to have it for another 5-6 years. Or you need nuclear power like we were talking about before, which is expensive, but it's carbon-free. So all of these answers, they're there, but they're all in the R&D stages, and they're 5 to 7 years away, and that's the problem. You're going to have, in my view, natural gas-fired combustion turbines, and probably somewhat more of them, to make the bridge from where we are today with reliable power to 2032 or 33, when we'll be able to interconnect all the other stuff to make this all work. I mean, that's a fact, okay? Those resources don't exist in the quantities to fuel a data center.
Can I just ask one simple question? This is Barbara Ray speaking. What do you know about the intention of Silicon Valley to continue to expand on property which I understand belongs to the Gates in eastern Washington? I believe there's a substantial plan for a city and for production.
Barbara, I just don't know. I mean, I know there are a lot of data centers springing up all over the place. Like I told you, I can identify 8,000 to 10,000 megawatts of data centers today that have plans for specific areas. I don't know anything about Gates land in eastern Washington. You know, there are data center facilities in Prineville, Oregon, in Umatilla, Washington, in northern Wasco County, and now in Klickitat County, as well as in Hillsborough, in Portland, and down in Salem as well. Those are some of the locations where they're springing up. I'm unaware of the Gates property issue.
Open area in eastern Washington.
Yeah, well, yeah, I just don't know.
Thank you.
Okay. I have a question about the data centers, and I understood that rather than wiring in or whatever from an atomic facility or a nuclear facility, that they would take a tablet or however a small portion of the spent fuel and take that to the data center and have that spent fuel run the electricity for the data centers.
I don't think that's remotely possible, at least not at the present time. You've got a lot of R&D before something like that could happen. Again, all of this stuff, it gets in the newspaper headlines, it sounds great. It's 5 to 7 to 10 years away. It is not a reality today, and today is what we got to deal with. And so far, we're not dealing with it very successfully. Yeah.
Another obsession of the Trump administration is drill, baby, drill. And I understand they have frozen permitting for solar and wind projects. Is that correct?
I'm not sure. There's been a lot of talk about that, particularly about wind. I'm not certain that it slowed down solar to any significant extent, or even wind for that matter. I mean, you know, Trump says something and it may or may not be true or anything, so I haven't seen it yet. I suspect you'll see, if he carries through on the statements that he's made, some effects on wind. I'm less certain about effects on solar. He doesn't seem to be as wound up about that. But he is about wind, and about offshore wind in particular, which frankly he has some points on. But you know, that's as much as I can tell at this point in time. Yes, Sam.
Randy, over the decades, British Columbia Power has been a net producer of electricity, and a lot of it has been sent to California. What can you tell us about the hydropower available, if there is any left in British Columbia, that might help ease this supply shortage, at least in the near term, in the Northwest?
What I can tell you is somewhat favorable. British Columbia has just completed their so-called Site C project. This is a 1,000 megawatt, 1 gigawatt hydro project in the far north of the province on the Peace River. That will clearly generate, like I said, 1,000 megawatts of additional electricity by the end of this year. The problem is the transmission. Again, you only have 1,800 megawatts of transmission across the border, right now. And then you can get it into the main network, but whether you can get it to Portland and Seattle or the major load centers is somewhat more problematic. It will help, or it should help. Now, the Canadians will charge us an arm and a leg for it, as they always have. That's pretty consistent. But there is another 1,000 megawatts there. The problem is they've had real serious drought problems themselves for the last 2 years. So the availability of that is somewhat telling or suspect, but they do have, at least on paper and probably in reality over a longer time span, another 1,000 megawatts of hydro capacity, which is the only additional hydro capacity in the region, I think, that ever will be built. And that should help in times of real crisis, particularly on really cold days in the Northwest.
Good. I get to ask one as a microphone carrier. Goldendale isn't a very windy area because of the gorge right there, and it's a big windstorm. Can they produce a wind just to take care of themselves, their own data center, not to send it anywhere else?
Not enough. They can do some, and they're lined up to do. They've got a really good transmission plan for both solar and wind to fuel that data, to provide that transmission for that 1 gigawatt facility. But it still has to be. You have to interconnect all of that stuff. The transmission construction that's required is not nearly as extensive as most of the other things. But Bonneville's got a 5 or 6 year queue for interconnecting. So you got to wait 5 or 6 years before you're going to get the amount of power to fully fuel that data center. So it'll come, I think. It's one of the more better located one, a lot better than the 3 gigawatts that are in Hillsborough, where there's absolutely no way to get there. And without massive citizen resistance to the new transmission you're going to have to build at Hillsborough. But you can get there. It's just that it's going to be probably 2032, 2033 before you're going to have it all interconnected. Maybe you can make 2030, but that's pretty ambitious.
Is transmission of high voltage DC going to become practical someday?
Yeah, it is practical now for long distances. I mean, we have a DC intertie from Celilo near the Dalles Dam all the way down to Los Angeles, and we've had that since the late 60s that transmits 3,000 megawatts back and forth. It is possible you can have more DC, but DC is such that you can't interconnect along the way. It's just because you have to have a converter at each end of the station, and those are $250 million a crack. But I have a client, okay, who has proposed an under the Columbia River DC line from the Big Eddy substation, the Dalles in Oregon, along the Columbia River into Harborton, which is just on the northwest side of Portland. It's a 100-mile DC line. It's probably the best solution for the Hillsborough data center problem that exists, but it cost $1.5 billion. Now, by the time we get through with all the other transmission stuff, they'll be right up there with what the DC line costs. And the way Hillsborough is going, you're going to need an all of the above solution, I suspect, before you're going to be able to adequately supply that 3 gigawatts of low growth. But so you've got some emerging DC. Oh, and one other line that's important. You have an outfit called Grid United that is a private company that has proposed I'm trying to remember it's about an 1,100 mile DC line from North Dakota, think Bismarck to Colstrip in eastern Montana. That will wheel, my recollection is 3,000 megawatts. And North Dakota has lots of wind in that part of the country, and its generation pattern tends to be different from wind here in the Northwest. So you can tap that resource once this is completed, which would probably be 2032, 2033. And it's a major DC line, and it would interconnect the mid-state ISO, the Midwest ISO and the Southwest Power Pool ISO, the two grids in the northern central area of the country with our western area. First transmission line to do that. You know, you'd interconnect the Western Energy Coordinating Council, the 13 western states with the Midwest and a major transmission line. So that one is going to get built. And in fact, you have all of the investor-owned utilities in the Northwest that have signed up for that line already, because they can increase the capacity factors of their existing Montana wind by substituting North Dakota wind for that. You know, so when that wind doesn't blow in Montana, you can take it from North Dakota. So instead of having a 40% capacity factor, you know, Montana only line or wind project, you can in fact have a 70 or 80% capacity factor combining North Dakota and Montana. And because the wind pattern is different, you can but it's almost continuous given the amount of wind projects in North Dakota, you can tap that for reliability purposes as well. So that one is probably the single most promising DC line I see. And so there's a place for DC in the future, and I think you'll see considerably more of it.
So we get all our power from the Skagit, and I'm wondering, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, how likely is it that we're going to get the relicensing that we need in order to get the power? I mean, we're totally here dependent on that.
Yeah, I think, May, that you'll get it. And I think despite all the reservations or problems that one of the tribes has created up there, I mean, it's ironic. We dealt with the same tribe when you and I were at City Light, and they were fine. They were great. We solved all of our objections that anybody had. You know, you get a different person, a son of the person who dealt with us before, who has a very different attitude, and it's been an enormously rocky road. But I think that this administration will be very sympathetic to what the utility wants if it ever gets to that level. So I'm pretty confident you'll get a viable relicensing of the Skagit facility, you know, in a way that won't adversely impact power. Great. Thank you very, very much. Appreciate it.